Three Pillars of American Culture by Joy Thomas. Race, class, and gender, the three main social constructs in Western civilization. While these three pillars appear to be separate, I view them to be synonymous. Each one affects the other in a different way, and over time, their complex interactions have fused to become nearly indistinguishable from one another. Intersectionality is fluid, so while these pillars cannot exist without the other, many can function independently based on individual experience. Intersectionality essentially describes how discrimination interacts and overlaps in society. In the early 17th and 18th centuries, race was the first pillar to be clearly acknowledged. In my first primary source, quote, "When I was young, the white men came amongst us, bearing abundance along with them. I took them by the hand and have ever remained firm to my engagements. I now see another race of white men come amongst us, bearing the same abundance, and I expect they will be equally bountiful, which must be done if they wish to equally gain the affection of my people." End quote. This was a quote by Alabama Mingo, a Choctaw leader. Native Americans were initially open to white men coming, according to this text, hoping to trade goods and services. However, this openness would shift, and the assimilation of Native Americans was the first indication that race was not only recognized, it was now associated with class, which is our second pillar. This is demonstrated in the two pictures you see on the screen. Quote, "All the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him and save the man." End quote. As white settlers colonized Jamestown, slaves from Africa were now transported to the New World. Slavery would soon become a cornerstone in America, a dark shadow that would forever haunt America's history and forever impact its evolution. As America expanded, slavery, segregation, inequality, and immigration increased, all of which were attributes to white power and clearly established class systems. In the early 19th century, it showed promise with the movement to abolish slavery just after the Civil War had ended. As black slaves were emancipated, an interesting economic shift was also happening. Slavery was abolished in 1865, and slave owners now had to employ their former slaves. In a letter written to his former master, Jordan Anderson writes, quote, "As to my freedom, which you say I can have, Mandy says she would be afraid to go back without some proof that you are disposed to treat us justly and kindly. And we have concluded to test your sincerity by asking you to send us our wages for the time we served you. This will make us forget and forgive old scores and rely on your justice and friendship in the future. I served you faithfully for 32 years, and Mandy 20 years. Our earnings would amount to $11,680. End quote. The leap from slave to free man was a big one. But inequality, racism, and segregation were all realities blacks would continue to battle for centuries to come. While black people were free from their physical chains, they now had to be enslaved by legislative chains. Quote, "As northern states ended slavery, whites worried that free black men could also go to the polls in large numbers. In response, they adopted new laws that made racial discrimination the basis of American democracy." End quote. An influx in immigration brought more discrimination and racism, which only solidified white privilege. Quote, "A sense of sadness and bitterness ripened amongst black observers when immigrants often came to embrace a racial order conferring benefits to whites." End quote. Racism and discrimination became a socially acceptable norm. However, many families experienced a lot of good by immigrating to America. Many families fled Cuba to find safe haven from Fidel Castro. Coming to America could finally bring them freedom and safety. Of course, there were many challenges to being an immigrant, but the promise of freedom was worth any cost for those who sought refuge. As the economy grew in the 19th century, so did consumerism. It was no longer a necessity for households to produce all their goods at home. They could now affordably purchase manufactured products in the public sphere. This in turn created more blue-collar jobs. It also provided women, predominantly middle-class women, the opportunity to emerge from their secluded lives at home. For middle to upper-class women, they were no longer just homemakers. They were now the CEOs of the family, which encouraged marketers to target women specifically in their advertising. This shift in consumerism is perhaps the catalyst that encouraged women to find their voice publicly. It took nearly 100 years of women protesting to even be allowed to vote, and in 1920 the government enacted women's suffrage. Women's voices could finally matter in a legitimate and political sense. Although great progress was made in women's rights in the early 1900s, so much was still shifting in the United States. The Great Depression came down like a crushing weight on the American economy. All classes were impacted by it. Every person felt it, some more than others. The lower class, which was predominantly immigrants or minorities, suffered deeply. Without an economy, jobs, homes, assets, and even lives would be lost. Migrants moved from city to city in search of work, and many lower-class citizens and immigrants no longer had access to government aid. Unemployment rates for African Americans doubled and in some parts tripled during the Great Depression. Quote, African Americans were the first to see hours and jobs cut, and they experienced the highest unemployment rate during the 1930s. Since they were already relegated to lower-paying professions, African Americans had less of a financial cushion to fall back on when the economy collapsed. End quote. After the Great Depression ended, World War II would soon follow, bringing with it another shift in the social structure of American culture. As men went to fight in the war, their jobs were left unfulfilled, so women stepped into work. These gaps provided opportunity for women to prove their value to society, and more specifically to men. This is when the iconic Rosie the Riveter poster was made to encourage women to work, which is the poster you see on your screen. Women flooded the workforce, fulfilling roles in the military, factories, and even white-collar occupations. However, after World War II ended, society slowly reverted back. Women had stepped up in a time of need. Now they felt pressure to go back to how things used to be, but that was no longer an option. Women's involvement in the war had proved something the society had missed. Women could do the roles that men had traditionally done. But finding that equality would not be easy and would need to be fought for. Women's equality is still being fought for today in 2018. America would not be the land of the free and the home of the brave if it weren't for our history. Although our history has its shadows and dark spots, there is a perpetual light that burns with its original vision, to be a place of freedom for all. Race, gender, class are still the labels and the pillars we identify with and we adhere to. But there have been and will be more moments in our history where we forget those things and we come together. For now, we must continue to fight for equality for all human beings, to be kind to one another, and to find ways to bridge the social barriers we have taken centuries to build. Thank you.